Mother Bear shared her fur to make a soft nest in the crib. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The old wooden cabin creaked against the mountain wind as Zara Mitchell rocked her 3-month-old daughter back and forth in the dimly lit nursery. Little Iris had been crying for hours, her tiny fists clenched tight against the cold that seemed to seep through every crack in the walls. The fireplace downstairs provided some warmth, but up here in the baby's room, the chill was relentless. "Shh, my sweet girl," Zara whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. She had been up for 3 nights straight, and her husband Caleb was still in town getting supplies. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the October snow had started falling earlier than expected this year. Iris's cries grew louder, more desperate. Zara pressed her daughter closer to her chest, feeling the baby's little body shivering despite the thick blankets wrapped around her. The heating system had broken down 2 days ago, and they were relying on the fireplace and whatever warmth they could trap in the small rooms. As Zara walked to the window to check if Caleb's truck was coming up the mountain road, she noticed something moving in the tree line. A large, dark shape was making its way through the snow, moving with purpose toward their cabin. Her heart skipped a beat. Bears were common in these mountains, but they usually avoided human settlements. She pulled back from the window quickly, clutching Iris tighter. The baby's cries had quieted to soft whimpers, as if she too sensed something was different. Zara's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but there was no signal. There never was during snowstorms. The shape was getting closer now. Through the frosted glass, Zara could make out the massive form of a brown bear, but something was strange about its movement. It wasn't aggressive or searching for food. It was walking slowly, deliberately, as if it had a specific destination in mind. Zara's breath caught in her throat when the bear stopped directly beneath Iris's window. The animal looked up at the cabin, and for a moment, their eyes seemed to meet through the glass. The bear's expression wasn't threatening. It was almost concerned. Iris had gone completely quiet now, her big blue eyes staring up at her mother with an intensity that seemed beyond her 3 months of life. It was as if the baby could sense the presence outside, and strangely, it seemed to calm her. The bear began to circle the cabin slowly, its massive paws leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. Zara followed its movement from window to window, her heart pounding. She had lived in these mountains her entire life, but she had never seen behavior like this from a wild animal. When the bear stopped at the back of the cabin, directly below the kitchen window, Zara heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of wood creaking under weight. The bear was standing on its hind legs, pressing against the cabin wall. But then she heard something else. Something that didn't make sense. A low, rumbling sound that almost sounded like purring. The same sound a mother cat makes when comforting her kittens. Iris stirred in her arms, making a soft cooing sound. The baby's eyes were fixed on the window, and her tiny hand reached out as if she could see something her mother couldn't. The bear moved again, this time to the front porch. Zara heard the wooden steps groan under its weight. Her mind raced with possibilities. Should she try to barricade the door, call out for help, even though no one could hear her? But something deep in her instincts told her this bear wasn't here to harm them. The front door handle rattled gently. Not violently, as if something was trying to break in, but carefully, as if something was testing to see if it was unlocked. Zara's hand moved instinctively to the deadbolt, which she had forgotten to lock when Caleb left that morning. The handle turned slowly, and the door opened just a crack. A cold draft swept through the cabin, making the curtains dance and the fire downstairs flicker. But no massive bear head appeared in the doorway. Instead, Zara heard that same low, comforting rumble, now coming from just outside her home. Iris began to squirm in her arms, not in distress, but as if she wanted to get closer to whatever was outside. The baby's cries had completely stopped, replaced by curious little sounds that Zara had never heard her make before. Against every rational thought in her head, Zara found herself walking toward the stairs. Each step seemed to pull her forward, as if some invisible force was guiding her. The bear's presence, instead of terrifying her, was beginning to feel almost protective. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she could see through the crack in the door. The bear was sitting on the porch, its massive form blocking most of the doorway. But it wasn't trying to enter. It was waiting. And in that moment, as Iris reached her tiny hand toward the door and made a sound that was almost like a greeting, Zara realized that whatever was happening here was unlike anything she had ever experienced or heard of before. The bear's massive head appeared slowly in the crack of the doorway, and Zara's breath caught in her throat. But instead of the fierce, wild eyes she expected, she saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about wild animals. The bear's eyes were gentle, almost human-like in their expression, and they were focused entirely on the baby in her arms. Iris gurgled happily, her little arms reaching toward the bear as if she recognized an old friend. The sight was so surreal that Zara wondered if she was dreaming, if the exhaustion and isolation had finally made her lose her mind. But the cold air on her face and the weight of her daughter in her arms felt real enough. The bear made that low rumbling sound again, and this time Zara was certain it was some form of communication, not threatening, but almost questioning, as if the bear was asking permission for something. "What do you want?" Zara whispered, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She should have been terrified, should have been screaming or running or barricading herself somewhere safe. Instead, she found herself taking a small step closer to the door. The bear's response was unlike anything she could have imagined. It slowly backed away from the door, giving her space, but didn't leave the porch. Instead, it began to do something that made Zara's eyes widen in disbelief. The massive animal started pulling at its own fur. Not violently, but carefully, deliberately, pulling out tufts of thick, warm brown fur from its chest and shoulders. The bear gathered these clumps in its mouth, creating a small pile on the wooden porch. Iris was completely mesmerized. Her cries had turned into soft coos of wonder. The baby's eyes tracked every movement the bear made, and her tiny fingers grasped at the air as if trying to reach the animal through the door. Zara watched in stunned silence as the bear continued this strange ritual. The animal was clearly causing itself some discomfort, but it didn't stop. It kept pulling fur, adding to the growing pile, its eyes never leaving the baby. When the bear had gathered what seemed like enough fur to fill a small basket, it did something that made Zara's heart nearly stop. The animal gently picked up the pile in its mouth and took a step toward the door, not aggressively, but with the same careful deliberation it had shown throughout this entire encounter. "Oh my God," Zara breathed, finally understanding what the bear was trying to do. It wanted to give the fur to Iris, but how could a wild animal possibly understand that a human baby was cold? How could it know that they needed warmth? The bear stopped just inside the doorway, close enough that Zara could smell its wild scent, could see the individual snowflakes melting on its massive form. It lowered its head and gently placed the pile of fur on the floor just inside the cabin, then immediately backed away again. Iris was reaching desperately toward the bear now, making sounds that were almost like laughter. The baby seemed completely unafraid, as if this enormous predator was the most natural thing in the world. Zara knelt down carefully, keeping one eye on the bear, and touched the fur with her free hand. It was incredibly soft and warm, still carrying the animal's body heat. There was enough to line a crib to provide the kind of insulation that could keep a baby warm through even the coldest mountain night. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing if the bear could understand her words, but feeling compelled to express her gratitude somehow. The bear's ears perked up at her voice, and it tilted its massive head to one side, studying her face with an intelligence that was almost human. Then, to Zara's amazement, the animal nodded. A clear, deliberate nod, as if acknowledging her thanks. But the bear wasn't finished. It turned away from the cabin and walked to the edge of the porch, then stopped and looked back at Zara and Iris. It made a soft chuffing sound, different from the rumbling purr it had made before. This sound was more urgent, more insistent. Zara followed the bear's gaze and saw what had captured its attention. In the distance, barely visible through the falling snow, was another shape moving through the trees. But this one was smaller, moving erratically, stumbling through the drifts. The bear made the chuffing sound again, louder this time, and the distant shape changed direction, heading toward the cabin. As it got closer, Zara realized what she was seeing. It was a bear cub, probably no more than a few months old, struggling through snow that was nearly as deep as it was tall. The mother bear on the porch called out again, and the cub's movements became more determined. But even from a distance, Zara could see that the little animal was in trouble. It kept falling, getting back up, falling again. The snow was too deep, the cold too intense for such a small creature. "Is that your baby?" Zara asked softly, and the mother bear turned to look at her with an expression that needed no translation. It was the same look Zara wore when Iris was in distress, pure maternal concern. The cub was getting closer now, but its movements were becoming weaker. It stumbled and fell, tried to get up, then fell again. The mother bear paced anxiously on the porch, torn between helping her cub and staying near the human baby that had somehow claimed her attention. Iris began to fuss in Zara's arms, as if she too could sense the distress of the struggling cub. The baby's cries weren't of fear or cold anymore, but seemed to echo the mother bear's anxiety. Without thinking, Zara made a decision that would have seemed insane just an hour ago. She stepped out onto the porch, still holding Iris, and called out to the struggling cub. "Come on, little one, you can make it." The mother bear looked at her in surprise, then made an encouraging sound toward her cub. The little bear seemed to gather strength from their combined encouragement and managed to stumble forward a few more steps. But then disaster struck. The cub stepped into a hidden depression in the snow and disappeared from sight completely. The mother bear let out a roar of distress that shook the cabin windows, and without hesitation, she leaped from the porch and bounded through the snow toward where her cub had vanished. Zara watched in horror as the mother bear dug frantically at the snow, her powerful claws sending white powder flying in all directions. The cub had fallen into what must have been a creek bed or natural depression, now filled with deep, soft snow that could trap a small animal like quicksand. Iris was crying now, her little voice joining the chorus of distress. The baby seemed to understand that something terrible was happening, that the gentle giant who had brought them warmth was now in desperate need of help. The mother bear's digging became more frantic. She had managed to uncover part of her cub, but the little one wasn't moving. The snow had been too deep, too cold. The mother bear nuzzled her cub desperately, making heartbroken sounds that cut through Zara like a knife. Looking down at Iris, seeing the tears in her own baby's eyes, Zara made another decision that defied all logic and reason. She wrapped Iris more tightly in her blankets, gathered up the warm fur the mother bear had given them, and stepped off the porch into the deep snow. The cold hit her immediately, soaking through her slippers and thin nightgown, but she pushed forward. The mother bear looked up as she approached, and their eyes met across the snowy expanse. In that moment, two mothers recognized each other, understood each other, and silently agreed to do whatever it took to save a baby's life. "Let me help," Zara said, though she had no idea how she could possibly help a creature she knew nothing about. But as she reached the edge of the depression where the cub lay motionless, she saw something that gave her hope. The little bear's eyes were open, blinking slowly. It was alive, but clearly suffering from cold and exhaustion. Its breathing was shallow, its little body barely moving. Zara knelt in the snow, still holding Iris with one arm, and began to wrap the warm fur around the cub with her free hand. The mother bear watched intently, making soft, encouraging sounds as Zara worked to warm her baby. The fur was incredibly effective. Within minutes, the cub's breathing became stronger, and it began to move more actively. The mother bear gently nuzzled her baby, and the cub responded with weak but determined sounds. But as Zara helped wrap the cub in the warm fur, something extraordinary happened. Iris, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, reached out her tiny hand and gently touched the cub's head. The moment her fingers made contact with the little bear's fur, both babies seemed to calm completely. The cub looked up at Iris with curious, intelligent eyes, and Iris gurgled softly, as if she were trying to communicate. The two babies, one human and one bear, regarded each other with the kind of innocent wonder that only the very young can possess. The mother bear watched this interaction with an expression that Zara could only describe as amazement. The animal seemed to understand that something special was happening, something that went beyond the natural order of predator and prey, wild and tame. As the snow continued to fall around them, creating a quiet, magical world of white, Zara realized that this moment was changing all of them. The boundaries between species, between wild and civilized, between fear and trust, were dissolving in the presence of two babies who saw only potential friends in each other. But even as this miraculous scene unfolded, Zara heard something in the distance that made her blood run cold. The sound of an engine growing closer. Caleb was coming home, and she had no idea how he would react to finding his wife and daughter in the snow, helping a bear and her cub. The mother bear heard it too, and her posture immediately changed. The gentle, nurturing animal that had shared her fur and allowed a human to help her cub suddenly remembered that she was a wild creature in the presence of humans. Her protective instincts flared, and she moved to position herself between her cub and the approaching sound. But she didn't take her cub and flee, as Zara expected. Instead, she looked at Zara with an expression that seemed to ask a question about trust, about the continuation of this impossible moment, about whether the approaching human would understand what was happening here. The engine sound was getting closer now, and Zara could see headlights beginning to penetrate the falling snow. In just a few minutes, Caleb would arrive to find a scene that would be impossible to explain, impossible to believe. As Iris reached out again to touch the bear cub, and the mother bear continued to watch the approaching lights with wary intelligence, Zara realized that whatever happened next would determine not just the immediate fate of these two animal families, but something much larger. Something that would change the way she understood the world, the way she understood the invisible connections that exist between all living things. The headlights were getting brighter now, cutting through the swirling snow like twin beams of judgment. Zara could hear the familiar sound of Caleb's old pickup truck struggling up the steep mountain road, the engine straining against the grade and the weather. She had maybe 3 minutes before he would round the final curve and see this impossible scene. The mother bear seemed to sense the urgency, too. She moved closer to her cub, who was now breathing more easily thanks to the warm fur wrapping, but her eyes never left the approaching lights. The massive animal was caught between two powerful instincts: the need to protect her young from potential human threat, and something else. Something that kept her rooted to this spot beside Zara and Iris. "Please don't leave," Zara whispered, surprising herself with the words. "He's my husband. He won't hurt you." But even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure. Caleb was a good man, a gentle man with their daughter, but he was also a practical mountain dweller who had grown up with very clear ideas about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Finding his wife and baby daughter in the snow, helping a bear, would challenge everything he believed about safety and common sense. The bear cub stirred in its wrapping of fur, making small mewing sounds that seemed to calm both Iris and its mother. The little creature was definitely stronger now, its eyes brighter and more alert. It looked up at Iris with what could only be described as gratitude, and Iris responded with soft baby sounds that seemed almost like a lullaby. The truck was closer now. Zara could see the specific pattern of Caleb's headlights, the way the left one was slightly dimmer than the right. She could hear the particular rattle of the loose tailgate that he had been meaning to fix for months. In less than 2 minutes, he would pull into their driveway and see his family in what would appear to be mortal danger. The mother bear made a decision. Instead of fleeing with her cub, she did something that made Zara's heart race with both wonder and terror. The massive animal moved protectively between the approaching headlights and the two babies, positioning herself so that she would be the first thing Caleb saw when he arrived. "No, that's the wrong thing to do," Zara said urgently. "If he sees you like that, he'll think you're threatening us. He might—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that her husband might do something drastic to protect his family. But the bear seemed to understand more than Zara gave her credit for. The animal wasn't positioning herself aggressively. Instead, she sat down in the snow, making herself appear as non-threatening as possible while still maintaining her protective stance. It was the posture of a guardian, not a predator. The truck's engine grew louder, and suddenly the headlights swept across the cabin as Caleb rounded the final curve. The beams illuminated the entire scene. Zara kneeling in the snow holding Iris, the mother bear sitting calmly nearby, and the small cub wrapped in fur between them. The truck's engine went silent immediately. Zara could picture Caleb behind the wheel, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the swirling snow. The truck door opened slowly, and Zara heard Caleb's boots hit the ground. She turned to see him standing beside the vehicle, one hand still on the door, the other reaching instinctively for the rifle rack mounted in his rear window. "Zara!" His voice carried across the snow, tight with controlled panic. "Don't move. I'm going to get the gun." "No!" Zara called out, more sharply than she intended. "Caleb, wait. Please, just wait." The mother bear turned to look at this new human, her massive head moving slowly and deliberately. There was no aggression in her posture, but there was unmistakable intelligence in her gaze. She was evaluating Caleb just as carefully as he was evaluating her. "Zara, what the hell is going on?" Caleb's voice was strained, fighting between his protective instincts and his trust in his wife's judgment. "Why are you outside? Why is there a bear right next to you and Iris?" Before Zara could answer, something happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Iris, who had been quietly watching the interaction between the adults, suddenly began to cry. Not the frightened wails she had been making earlier, but the demanding, angry cries of a baby who wanted something specific. The moment Iris's cries filled the air, the mother bear's entire demeanor shifted. The protective wariness disappeared, replaced by the focused attention of a mother responding to distress. The bear turned away from Caleb completely and moved closer to Iris, making soft rumbling sounds that seemed designed to comfort. And incredibly it worked. Iris's cries quieted, and she reached out toward the bear with both tiny hands. The baby was clearly asking to be closer to the massive animal, showing no fear whatsoever. Caleb stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his rifle, trying to process what he was witnessing. His baby daughter was not only unafraid of a wild bear, she seemed to prefer the animal's presence to being held by her own mother. "She gave us fur," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "The bear. She pulled fur from her own body to keep Iris warm, and then her cub was trapped in the snow, and we helped save it." "That's impossible," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see the evidence with his own eyes, the bear's patchy fur where she had pulled out tufts, the small cub wrapped in that same fur, the complete lack of aggression from an animal that should have seen them all as threats. The bear cub chose that moment to add its voice to the conversation. It made small chirping sounds that were clearly directed at Caleb, as if it were trying to explain the situation from its perspective. The little creature struggled to sit up in its fur wrapping, looking directly at the man with curious, intelligent eyes. Caleb took a tentative step forward, his hand moving away from the rifle. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Bears don't behave this way. They don't give gifts. They don't save human babies." "Maybe they do," Zara said softly. "Maybe we just never gave them the chance to show us." The mother bear seemed to sense that the immediate danger had passed. She stood up slowly and walked to her cub, nuzzling it gently before picking up one corner of the fur wrapping in her mouth. But instead of taking the fur away, she carefully adjusted it to keep her baby warmer. Then she did something that made both Caleb and Zara gasp in amazement. The massive animal approached Zara and Iris, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a nervous animal. She stopped just an arm's length away and lowered her great head until she was at eye level with the human baby. Iris gurgled with delight and reached out to touch the bear's nose. Her tiny fingers made contact with the wet, black surface, and both babies, human and bear, seemed to sigh with contentment. "Jesus Christ," Caleb breathed, taking another step closer. "She's treating Iris like her own cub." The bear looked up at him when he spoke, and for a moment their eyes met. Caleb later swore that he saw something in that gaze that he had never expected to see in a wild animal. Recognition of shared parenthood. Acknowledgement of the common ground between them as protectors of the young. "What do we do now?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Zara could answer, they heard another sound that made all three humans tense with new worry. The distant rumble of another engine, this one coming from the opposite direction on the mountain road. Someone else was driving up the mountain in the middle of a snowstorm. The mother bear heard it too, and her relaxed posture immediately shifted back to alertness. She moved protectively over her cub, but she didn't flee. Instead, she looked at Caleb and Zara with an expression that seemed to ask for their protection in return. The approaching engine had a different sound than Caleb's truck. It was deeper, more powerful, and it was moving faster than anyone should drive on these mountain roads in a snowstorm. As the sound grew closer, Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "That's not one of our neighbors," Caleb said grimly. "Nobody else drives that kind of vehicle up here." The headlights appeared around the curve, much brighter and more aggressive than Caleb's had been. This was a large SUV or truck, equipped with off-road lights that cut through the snow like searchlights. As it approached, they could hear loud music playing from inside, and the vehicle was weaving slightly, as if the driver wasn't entirely in control. "Oh no," Zara whispered, clutching Iris closer. She recognized that vehicle now. It belonged to Derek Morrison, Caleb's cousin who lived down in the valley. Derek was known for his drinking, his loud mouth, and his attitude toward wildlife that bordered on the hostile. The SUV pulled into their driveway with unnecessary aggression, snow flying from its oversized tires. The music was loud enough to be heard clearly even through the closed windows, and when the engine shut off, the sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. Derek emerged from the vehicle with the careful precision of someone who was trying not to appear as drunk as he actually was. He was carrying something in his hand, and when the porch light caught it, Zara's heart sank. It was a high-powered rifle with a scope. "Caleb!" Derek called out, his voice too loud and slightly slurred. "Heard on the police scanner that someone spotted a bear up this way. Thought you might want some help dealing with it before it becomes a problem." The mother bear's posture changed instantly. Every muscle in her massive body tensed, and she moved to place herself directly between Derek and both cubs, human and bear. The protective stance she had maintained with Caleb had been cautious but trusting. This was different. This was the posture of an animal preparing to fight to the death. Derek spotted the bear immediately, and his reaction was exactly what Zara had feared. "Holy shit, there it is!" he shouted, raising his rifle. "Get away from it, Zara. That thing's dangerous." "Derek, no!" Caleb shouted, moving quickly to position himself between his cousin and the bear. "Don't shoot! You don't understand what's happening here." But Derek was drunk, excited by the prospect of a hunt, and not inclined to listen to reason. "What's to understand? It's a bear, Caleb, a dangerous wild animal that's threatening your family. Stand aside and let me handle this." The mother bear understood the threat immediately. She began to make sounds that Zara had never heard from her before, deep, rumbling growls that seemed to come from the very center of her being. But she didn't attack. Instead, she carefully nudged her cub with her nose, encouraging it to move away from the danger. The cub tried to comply, struggling to stand in its fur wrapping, but it was still weak from its earlier ordeal. The little creature stumbled and fell, making distressed sounds that cut through the night air like a cry for help. The mother bear's response to her cub's distress was immediate and heartbreaking. She abandoned her defensive posture and moved to her baby, nuzzling it gently while making soft, comforting sounds. In that moment, she was completely vulnerable, focused entirely on her young one, and trusting the humans around her to honor the bond they had created. It was exactly the wrong thing to do with the Derek present. The drunk man saw the bear's movement toward her cub as an opportunity, a clear shot at a stationary target. "Perfect," Derek muttered, raising his rifle to his shoulder. "This is going to be easier than I thought." "Derek, I swear to God, if you pull that trigger, I will never forgive you," Caleb said, his voice carrying a tone that made everyone present take notice. Zara had never heard her husband sound so dangerous, so absolutely certain of his position. "You've lost your mind," Derek replied, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "That thing is a threat to your family, to your baby daughter." "That thing saved my baby daughter," Zara said, stepping forward despite Caleb's gesture for her to stay back. "She gave us warmth when Iris was freezing. She's not a threat, she's a mother, just like me." Derek looked at Zara as if she had completely lost her sanity. "Bears don't save human babies, Zara. That's Disney movie bullshit. In the real world, bears kill people." "Then explain this," Caleb said, gesturing toward the scene in front of them. Explain why that bear is wrapping her cub in fur instead of attacking us. Explain why my daughter reaches for her instead of crying. Explain why a wild animal is asking us for protection instead of running away. Derek looked more closely at the scene for the first time, taking in details he had missed in his initial excitement. The bear's patchy fur, the obvious care with which she was tending to both cubs, the complete lack of aggression despite the presence of multiple humans and a clear threat. "I don't know what kind of sick joke this is," Derek said finally, "but I'm not falling for it. Bears are dangerous, period, and I'm not leaving my family's safety to chance." He began to raise the rifle again, and in that moment several things happened at once. The mother bear, sensing the renewed threat, positioned herself protectively over both cubs, making herself the largest possible target to draw fire away from the babies. Caleb lunged forward, trying to reach Derek before he could take the shot. Zara clutched Iris closer, moving to shield both human and bear cubs with her own body, and Iris, perhaps sensing the danger in a way that only the very young can, began to cry with a sound that was both heartbreaking and eerily similar to the distress calls the bear cub had been making earlier. The similarity between the two babies' cries was so striking that it stopped everyone in their tracks. Derek hesitated with his finger on the trigger. Caleb froze mid-lunge, and even the mother bear lifted her head to look at the human baby with an expression of recognition and concern. In that moment of hesitation, something extraordinary happened. The bear cub, wrapped in its mother's fur, struggled to its feet and moved toward Iris. The little creature was still weak, still unsteady, but it was determined to reach the crying human baby. When the cub finally made it to Zara's feet, it did something that brought tears to her eyes. The little bear reached up with one small paw and gently touched Iris's foot, making soft chirping sounds that seemed designed to offer comfort. Iris's cries immediately softened, and she looked down at the bear cub with wonder. The two babies regarded each other for a moment, and then Iris did something that made every adult present catch their breath. The human baby reached down and gently stroked the bear cub's head, just as she might pet a friendly dog. The cub leaned into her touch, making contented sounds, and for a moment the two young creatures seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from the tension and conflict surrounding them. "My God," Derek whispered, lowering his rifle slightly. They're playing together." "They're not playing," Zara said softly. "They're communicating. They understand each other in a way that we can't even comprehend." The mother bear watched this interaction with an expression that seemed almost proud. She looked at each of the humans in turn, as if she were trying to communicate something important, something that went beyond the immediate situation. And then, just as the moment seemed to be reaching some kind of resolution, they heard a new sound that changed everything once again. This time, it wasn't an engine or voices. It was the deep, resonant call of another bear, coming from somewhere in the forest behind the cabin. The mother bear's entire body went rigid at the sound. She lifted her head and answered with a call of her own, but there was something different about this response. It wasn't the gentle rumbling they had heard before, or the protective growl she had made when Derek threatened them. This was something else entirely. This was fear. The sound came again from the forest, closer this time, and now all three humans could hear it clearly. It was deeper than the mother bear's calls, more aggressive, with an undertone that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The mother bear immediately moved to her cub, gathering the little one closer to her body while keeping her eyes fixed on the tree line. "What is that?" Derek asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. The rifle in his hands suddenly seemed inadequate against whatever was making that sound. Caleb's face had gone pale. He had lived in these mountains his entire life, had heard every sound the wilderness could make, but this was something different. Something that made his survival instincts scream warnings he couldn't ignore. "That's not the same bear," he said quietly. "That's something much bigger." The mother bear began making urgent sounds toward her cub, nudging it insistently. But the little one was still weak, still struggling with the effects of its earlier ordeal. It tried to move quickly, but kept stumbling in the deep snow. Zara felt Iris tense in her arms as another call echoed through the forest, this one so close that snow fell from the cabin's roof from the vibration. The human baby began to whimper, and the bear cub responded with distressed chirping sounds. Both young ones seemed to sense the approaching danger. "We need to get inside," Caleb said, moving toward Zara and Iris. "All of us, now." But the mother bear wasn't moving toward safety. Instead, she positioned herself between the approaching sounds and everyone else, including her own cub. Her massive body was trembling, not from cold, but from the effort of controlling her own fear. She was preparing to make a stand against something that terrified her. Derek finally lowered his rifle completely. "If she's scared of whatever's coming, then we should all be scared," he said, his voice shaking slightly. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to shake, and they could hear the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Whatever was approaching was moving with purpose, crashing through underbrush that would stop most animals. "Inside," Caleb repeated, more urgently this time. "Zara, take Iris inside now." But as Zara turned toward the cabin, the mother bear did something that stopped her cold. The massive animal moved directly into her path, blocking her route to safety. At first, Zara thought the bear was threatening them, but then she saw the expression in the animal's eyes. The mother bear wasn't trying to stop them from reaching safety. She was trying to tell them that the cabin wasn't safe, that whatever was coming would not be stopped by wooden walls and glass windows. "She wants us to stay together," Zara said, understanding flooding through her. "She knows something we don't." The crashing sounds were getting closer, and now they could see the trees themselves moving as something large forced its way through them. Derek raised his rifle again, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. "What the hell is out there?" he whispered. The answer came a moment later, as the largest bear any of them had ever seen emerged from the tree line. This wasn't just bigger than the mother bear. It was massive, beyond anything that should exist in these mountains. Its fur was darker, almost black, and its eyes reflected the cabin's lights with an intelligence that was both ancient and deeply unsettling. The giant bear stopped at the edge of the clearing and studied the scene before it. Its gaze moved from the humans to the mother bear, then to the two cubs, human and animal, who were now huddled together near Zara's feet. The mother bear began making sounds unlike anything they had heard from her before. These weren't the gentle rumbles or protective growls they had grown accustomed to. These were submissive sounds, the kind an animal makes when acknowledging a superior power. "Oh, God," Derek breathed. "That's the alpha. That's the dominant male." But as they watched, something strange became apparent. The giant bear's attention wasn't focused on the humans or even on the mother bear. It was focused entirely on the two cubs, and there was something in its gaze that none of them could interpret. The massive animal began to move forward slowly, and the mother bear immediately positioned herself between it and the babies. She was clearly terrified, but she didn't back down. Her maternal instincts were stronger than her fear, even when facing something that could kill her without effort. The giant bear stopped just outside what seemed to be some invisible boundary, studying the mother bear's defensive posture. Then it did something none of them expected. It sat down in the snow, making itself appear less threatening, and began making soft rumbling sounds. It's talking to her," Zara whispered. The mother bear's posture relaxed slightly, but she didn't move away from the cubs. She responded with her own sounds, and what followed was clearly a conversation in a language that predated human speech by millions of years. Derek was staring at the scene with his mouth open. "Bears don't do this," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "This isn't natural behavior." "Maybe it is," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe we just never stayed around long enough to see it." The conversation between the two bears continued for several minutes, with the mother bear occasionally gesturing toward the cubs with her massive head. The giant bear listened patiently, its intelligent eyes never leaving the small creatures that had somehow become the center of this extraordinary gathering. Finally, the massive animal stood up and approached slowly. The mother bear tensed, but didn't retreat. She allowed the giant to come close enough to examine both cubs, human and bear. When the giant bear's enormous head lowered to sniff Iris, Zara's every instinct screamed at her to run. The animal's head was larger than her entire torso, its teeth clearly visible as it breathed near her daughter, but Iris showed no fear. Instead, the baby reached out with one tiny hand and touched the bear's nose, just as she had done with the mother bear. The giant bear's reaction was immediate and shocking. The massive animal's eyes widened, and it made a sound that was almost like a gasp of surprise. It pulled back slightly, studying Iris with an intensity that made everyone present hold their breath. Then the giant bear did something that defied every expectation they had about wild animal behavior. It gently nuzzled the bear cub, then turned to Iris, and very carefully, very gently, touched the human baby's cheek with its enormous nose. In that moment, both cubs seemed to recognize something in the giant bear. The bear cub made happy chirping sounds and tried to climb toward the massive animal. Iris gurgled with delight and reached for the giant's fur with both hands. "It's accepting them," Zara said in amazement. "Both of them. It sees them as a part of the same family." But their wonder was interrupted by yet another sound from the forest. This time, it wasn't the call of a bear. It was something that made the hair on the back of Caleb's neck stand up, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching fast, with sirens wailing in the distance. Derek's face went white as he recognized the implications. Someone must have heard my police scanner chatter about bears in the area. They're sending backup. The approaching sirens meant officials, probably game wardens or state police, possibly with orders to eliminate any dangerous wildlife found near human habitation. The peaceful scene that had developed between the bears and humans was about to be shattered by people who would see only threats to be neutralized. The mother bear heard the sirens too, and her calm demeanor immediately shifted back to alarm. But instead of fleeing, she looked at Caleb and Zara with an expression that seemed to plead for understanding, for protection. The giant bear's reaction was different. It stood to its full, imposing height and turned toward the approaching sounds with unmistakable hostility. This was an animal that had no intention of running from human authority figures. "This is going to be a disaster," Caleb said grimly. "When they see 3 bears this close to humans, especially with a baby involved, they're going to shoot first and ask questions later." Derek was already moving toward his vehicle. "I've got to radio them, tell them the situation is under control," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "How do you explain to armed officials that you've discovered bears capable of complex emotional reasoning?" The sirens were getting closer, and now they could see the flashing lights reflecting off the snow-covered trees. Multiple vehicles, moving fast, with the kind of urgency that suggested they viewed this as a life-or-death emergency. Zara looked down at Iris, who was still reaching for the giant bear with complete trust and affection. The bear cub was pressed against her feet, seeking comfort from the only human it had learned to trust. The mother bear was looking at her with eyes that seemed to ask for a miracle. "We can't let them shoot these bears," Zara said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Not after what we've seen tonight, not after what they've shown us." "How do we stop them?" Caleb asked. "How do we explain something that we don't even understand ourselves?" The answer came from an unexpected source. The giant bear, who had been watching the approaching lights with growing agitation, suddenly moved toward the humans. But instead of threatening them, it did something that left them all speechless. The massive animal carefully, deliberately, lay down in the snow between the mother bear and cubs on one side, and the approaching vehicles on the other. It positioned itself so that anyone arriving would see it as the protector of the humans, not their threat. The mother bear immediately understood what the giant was doing. She moved to lie down beside him, her cub nestled safely between them. Both bears arranged themselves so that they appeared to be guarding Zara, Caleb, and Iris rather than menacing them. "They're making themselves shields," Caleb said in amazement. "They're protecting us from the people who are coming to protect us." The first vehicle rounded the curve with lights blazing and sirens screaming. It was a state police SUV, followed closely by a game warden's truck and an emergency medical vehicle. The convoy pulled into the driveway with the kind of aggressive urgency that meant they expected to find a scene of carnage. The lead officer emerged from his vehicle with his sidearm drawn, taking in the scene with obvious confusion. He had clearly expected to find humans under attack by dangerous wildlife. Instead, he found a family standing calmly in the snow, flanked by bears that appeared to be protecting rather than threatening them. "Is everyone all right?" the officer called out, his weapon still drawn but pointed at the ground. "Are you being held captive by these animals?" The question was so absurd, given what they had witnessed, that Zara almost laughed. "Officer, we're fine," she called back. "More than fine. These bears, they're not dangerous. They're trying to help us." The game warden had emerged from his truck carrying a tranquilizer rifle, but he had stopped dead when he saw the bear's protective posture. "I've never seen behavior like this," he said to his partner. "These animals should have fled the moment they heard our sirens." The giant bear lifted its massive head and looked directly at the approaching officials. There was no aggression in its gaze, but there was unmistakable warning. The message was clear: "You will not harm these humans or the young ones we are protecting." The bear cub chose that moment to make its presence known, emerging from between the two adult bears with the piece of fur still wrapped around its small body. It looked at the newcomers with curious eyes, showing no fear of the additional humans. "There's a cub," the game warden said, lowering his tranquilizer gun slightly. "That explains the protective behavior, but not why they're protecting the humans instead of just their own young." Derek had managed to reach his radio and was trying to explain the situation to the arriving officials, but his words sounded insane even to him. "The bears are friendly," he kept repeating. "They're not attacking anyone. They actually saved the baby." The lead officer looked at Derek with the expression of someone trying to determine if he was dealing with a hostage situation or a mental health crisis. "Sir, I need you to step away from the animals and explain what's happening here." But as Derek started to move toward the officers, something happened that changed the entire dynamic once again. Iris, who had been quietly watching all the new arrivals, suddenly began to cry. Not the frightened wails they had heard earlier, but the demanding cries of a baby who wanted something specific. The moment Iris's cries filled the air, Both adult bears immediately focused on her with laser-like attention. The mother bear began making soft rumbling sounds designed to comfort, while the giant bear moved slightly closer, positioning itself so that its massive bulk could block the cold wind from reaching the human baby. The bear cub, responding to Iris's distress, struggled to climb up Zara's leg, clearly trying to reach the crying human baby to offer comfort. The arriving officials watched this scene with growing amazement. They had come expecting to deal with dangerous wildlife threatening human life. Instead, they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about animal behavior. The bears are responding to the baby's cries like they're her protectors, the game warden said in disbelief. This goes against every training manual I've ever read. The EMT who had arrived with the convoy was staring at the scene with professional interest. The baby doesn't appear to be in any distress except for normal infant crying, she observed. There are no signs of attack or injury. In fact, she seems calmer when the bears are close to her. As if to prove the EMT's point, Iris's cries began to quiet as the bear cub finally managed to reach her. The little creature gently nuzzled against the human baby, making soft sounds that seemed designed to offer comfort. Iris responded by reaching out to stroke the cub's fur, and her cries stopped completely. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind through the trees and the soft sounds of contentment from both babies. The armed officials stood frozen, trying to process a scene that defied every protocol they had been trained to follow. Finally, the lead officer holstered his weapon. "I don't know what we're dealing with here," he said, "but it's clear that no one is in immediate danger. At least, not from the bears." But even as he spoke, they heard yet another sound that made everyone tense with new concern. This time, it was the unmistakable whine of helicopter rotors cutting through the night air. Someone had called in aerial support, and the situation was about to become much more complicated. The giant bear heard the helicopter too, and its reaction was immediate and alarming. The massive animal rose to its feet with a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. This was a sound they hadn't heard before, deeper and more threatening than anything the bears had produced during the entire evening. The mother bear responded to the giant's alarm by moving protectively over both cubs, human and bear, but her positioning suggested that she wasn't just protecting them from the approaching helicopter. She was preparing for something much worse. As the helicopter's searchlight swept across the clearing, illuminating the entire scene in harsh white light, Zara realized that their extraordinary evening was about to take another dramatic turn. The bears' behavior suggested that the approaching aircraft represented a threat far greater than anything they had faced so far. And in the distance, barely audible over the sound of the helicopter, came another sound that made Zara's blood run cold. More bear calls, coming from multiple directions in the forest. Deep, aggressive sounds that suggested the giant bear hadn't been alone when it emerged from the trees. Whatever was about to happen, Zara realized, their small group of humans and bears was about to be outnumbered by forces they didn't understand and couldn't predict. The protective circle that had formed around the two babies was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The helicopter's searchlight swept back and forth across the clearing, casting moving shadows that made everything look surreal and threatening. The pilot's voice crackled through a loudspeaker, cutting through the night air with mechanical authority. "This is State Police Aviation Unit 7. We have visual confirmation of multiple large animals in close proximity to civilians. Ground units, maintain safe distance while we assess the threat level." The giant bear's response to the helicopter was unlike anything they had witnessed from him before. The massive animal reared up on its hind legs, standing to its full imposing height, and roared a challenge at the aircraft that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It was a sound of pure defiance, a declaration that this territory and these creatures under his protection would not be surrendered without a fight. The mother bear immediately began herding both cubs toward the cabin, but not in flight. Her movements were deliberate, tactical, as if she was executing a plan that had been discussed in that strange conversation with the giant bear. "They're not running," the game warden observed, speaking into his radio. "Repeat, the animals are not showing typical flight response to aircraft presence. They appear to be organizing." Derek had gone completely pale, his earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization that they were witnessing something far beyond normal animal behavior. "Caleb," he said urgently, "I think we need to get inside the cabin. All of us. Right now." But even as he spoke, the sounds from the forest were growing closer and more numerous. The calls were coming from at least 6 different directions, suggesting that whatever pack or family group was approaching had spread out to surround the clearing. Caleb grabbed Zara's arm. "We need to move," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, none of them knew where safety lay anymore. The cabin seemed inadequate against what was approaching, but the bears who had shown them such kindness were now preparing for what looked like a war. The helicopter pilot's voice came through the speaker again, more urgent this time. "Ground units, we're seeing additional heat signatures moving through the forest. Large animals, multiple contacts, approaching from all directions. This appears to be coordinated behavior." The lead police officer was speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for additional backup and specialized wildlife response teams. But even as he made the calls, Zara could see the doubt in his eyes. He was trained to deal with dangerous animals, but not with animals that displayed tactical intelligence. The bear cub had pressed itself against Zara's legs, making soft whimpering sounds that seemed to be asking for comfort. Iris, still in her mother's arms, was reaching down toward the little creature with obvious concern. Even at 3 months old, the human baby seemed to understand that her friend was frightened. The mother bear noticed this interaction and made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of focusing on the approaching threats, she moved closer to Zara and Iris, positioning herself so that the human mother and baby were between her massive body and the cabin wall. She was using her own form as a shield while simultaneously creating a protected pocket for both families. "She's trying to keep us all together," Zara said, understanding flooding through her. "She knows something about what's coming that we don't." The giant bear had dropped back to all fours but remained alert, his massive head turning to track the sounds coming from different parts of the forest. His posture suggested that he was waiting for something specific, some signal or development that would determine his next action. The first of the approaching bears became visible at the tree line to the east, a large brown bear that moved with the confidence of an animal that had never encountered humans. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and studied the scene with intelligent eyes that reflected the helicopter's searchlight. "Jesus," Derek breathed. "How many of them are there?" The answer came quickly, as more bears emerged from the forest at different points around the clearing. They weren't charging or showing aggression toward the humans. Instead, they were taking up positions that formed a rough circle around the entire area, as if they were creating a perimeter. The game warden was speaking rapidly into his radio, trying to describe what he was seeing to his supervisors. "We have multiple large bears, at least 8 visible so far, displaying coordinated territorial behavior. They appear to be surrounding the human habitation but showing no direct aggression toward the civilians." "This isn't territorial behavior," the EMT said quietly. She had been observing the scene with professional detachment, but now her voice carried a note of awe. "This is protective behavior. They're forming a defensive circle." The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through the speaker again, but this time there was uncertainty in his tone. "Ground control. The animals are not dispersing in response to aircraft presence. Repeat, standard dispersal tactics are ineffective. Request guidance on how to proceed. One of the newly arrived bears, a massive female with distinctive light-colored markings on her chest, began making sounds toward the giant bear at the center of the clearing. The conversation that followed was clearly in the same complex language they had witnessed earlier, but this time it involved multiple participants. As the bears communicated, Iris began making soft sounds that seemed to mirror the rhythm of their calls. The baby wasn't crying or showing distress. She was participating in the conversation in her own way, as if she understood something about what was being discussed. The bear cub responded to Iris's sounds by pressing closer to her, making its own soft chirping noises. The two babies were clearly communicating with each other, creating a bridge between their species that none of the adults, human or bear, could fully comprehend. "They're including her in their discussion," Zara said in amazement. "They're treating Iris like she's part of their family." The mother bear turned to look at Zara when she spoke, and for a moment their eyes met with perfect understanding. The massive animal nodded once, a deliberate acknowledgement of what Zara had observed, but their wonder was interrupted by a new development that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The helicopter's searchlight had caught something moving on the mountain road above them, and the pilot's voice carried a new note of alarm. "Ground units, we have vehicles approaching your location from the upper access road. Multiple units, moving fast, no emergency lighting. This does not appear to be official response." Caleb's face went grim as he recognized the implications. The upper access road was rarely used except by local hunters and the occasional government survey team. Anyone approaching from that direction at this time of night, without coordinating with the emergency response, was likely to be trouble. Derek was already moving toward his radio. "That's probably Jake Morrison and his hunting buddies," he said urgently. "Jake's been complaining for months about bears getting too comfortable around human settlements. If he heard about this on the scanner..." The giant bear's reaction to this news was immediate and alarming. The massive animal began making urgent sounds toward the other bears in the circle, and their response was swift and coordinated. Instead of maintaining their defensive positions, they began moving inward, creating a tighter protective formation around the humans and cubs. "They know," Zara said with sudden clarity. "They know what those vehicles mean. They've encountered hunters before." The sound of engines was getting closer now, and they could see headlights cutting through the trees on the upper road. There were at least 3 vehicles, moving faster than was safe on the steep, winding mountain track. The lead police officer was trying to coordinate with the approaching vehicles through his radio, but he wasn't getting responses. Either the new arrivals weren't monitoring emergency frequencies, or they were deliberately ignoring official communications. The mother bear moved even closer to Zara and Iris, her massive body creating an almost complete shelter around them. The bear cub had climbed up Zara's leg and was now nestled between the human baby and its own mother, creating a living tableau of interspecies trust that would have been impossible to believe if they weren't witnessing it themselves. The first of the vehicles from the upper road came into view. A large pickup truck with a hunting spotlight mounted on its roof. The spotlight's beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the clearing and illuminating the circle of bears with harsh white light. The bears' reaction to the hunting spotlight was immediate and unmistakable. Every animal in the circle tensed, and several began making low growling sounds that carried a clear message of hostility. These weren't the protective rumbles they had made toward the official responders. These were the sounds of animals that recognized a mortal threat. The truck stopped at the edge of the clearing, and Jake Morrison stepped out carrying a high-powered rifle with a scope. He was followed by 3 other men, all armed, all clearly excited by the prospect of what they saw as a hunting opportunity. "Holy shit, Derek," Jake called out, his voice carrying the aggressive confidence of someone who viewed this entire situation as entertainment. "You weren't kidding about the bear problem. Looks like we've got ourselves a whole family reunion." The giant bear's response to Jake's voice was immediate and terrifying. The massive animal rose to its full height again and let out a roar that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. It was a sound of pure rage, a declaration of war that made every human present, including Jake and his friends, take an involuntary step backward. "Jake, don't shoot," Caleb called out urgently. "You don't understand what's happening here." But Jake wasn't listening. He was studying the scene through his rifle scope, looking for the best angle for what he clearly viewed as target practice. "Caleb, get away from those animals," he shouted back. "We'll have this cleaned up in 5 minutes." The mother bear seemed to understand that the situation had reached a critical point. She made urgent sounds toward her cub, encouraging it to stay close to Iris, then began moving to position herself between the hunters and both babies. The other bears in the circle were moving too, but not in retreat. They were tightening their formation, creating multiple layers of protection around the center of the clearing where the humans and cubs were gathered. "This is bad," the game warden said, speaking into his radio. "We have unauthorized armed civilians on scene, and the animals are responding defensively. If shooting starts, we're going to have multiple casualties, both human and animal." The helicopter pilot was trying to coordinate with ground control, asking for instructions on how to handle a situation that had no precedent in any training manual. "Ground control, we have what appears to be a standoff between armed civilians and a coordinated group of large predators. The animals are protecting rather than threatening the original civilians. Request immediate guidance." Jake had raised his rifle and was taking aim at the giant bear when something happened that no one could have predicted. Iris, who had been quietly watching the entire confrontation, suddenly let out a cry that was unlike any sound she had made before. It wasn't the normal crying of a human baby. It was a sound that seemed to combine the distress calls of both species, human and bear, into something that cut through the night air with heartbreaking clarity. The effect on the bears was instantaneous and powerful. Every animal in the circle immediately focused on the crying baby, and their aggressive postures toward the hunters shifted to something that could only be described as pleading. The giant bear, who had been preparing to charge Jake and his rifle, instead turned toward Iris and began making soft, comforting sounds. The mother bear moved protectively over both cubs, but her attention was entirely focused on calming the distressed human baby. Jake hesitated with his finger on the trigger, confused by the bear's reaction to the baby's cries. "What the hell is going on?" he said, lowering his rifle slightly. "Why aren't they attacking?" The bear cub, responding to Iris's distress, began making its own crying sounds that harmonized with the human baby's calls. The two babies were clearly communicating their fear and confusion, and their combined voices created a sound that touched something primal in every creature present. "They're scared," Zara said, her voice carrying across the clearing with perfect clarity. "Both babies are scared, and the bears are trying to protect them. All of them." The EMT had been watching the interaction between the babies with professional fascination. "The human infant is exhibiting stress responses that mirror those of the bear cub," she observed. "They're responding to each other's distress signals across species lines." One of Jake's hunting companions, a man named Ray, who had been silent until now, slowly lowered his own rifle. "Jake," he said quietly, "something's not right here. Those bears aren't acting like predators. They're acting like parents." The mother bear seemed to sense that there was division among the hunters. She made eye contact with Ray, the man who had spoken, and began making soft sounds that seemed directed specifically at him. Ray took a step forward, ignoring Jake's sharp gesture for him to stay back. "I've got kids," he said, as if he were explaining his actions to himself as much as to anyone else. "That bear? She's looking at me like another parent, like she's asking me to help protect the babies." The giant bear, who had been watching this exchange with obvious intelligence, made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of maintaining his aggressive posture toward the hunters, he sat down in the snow and began making the same soft, rumbling sounds they had heard him use earlier in his conversation with the mother bear. "He's trying to communicate," the game warden said in amazement. "Not threatening, communicating." Jake was looking around at his companions with growing frustration. "You're all losing your minds," he said. "These are wild animals, dangerous predators. They don't have feelings and they don't care about human babies." But even as he spoke, his words were contradicted by what everyone could see with their own eyes. The bears had arranged themselves in a perfect protective formation around the two babies, and their behavior showed every sign of emotional intelligence and genuine care. The helicopter pilot's voice came through the speaker again, but this time with a tone of wonder rather than alarm. "Ground control, you need to see this. The animals have formed what can only be described as a protective nursery around the human family. This is unlike anything in our wildlife behavioral databases." As if to emphasize the pilot's point, Iris's cries began to quiet as the bear cub nuzzled closer to her. The little creature was clearly trying to offer comfort, and the human baby was responding with soft coos of gratitude. The sight of the two babies comforting each other in the middle of what had threatened to become a violent confrontation seemed to affect everyone present. Even Jake's aggressive posture was beginning to soften as he watched the interaction. But just as it seemed that the situation might resolve peacefully, they heard yet another sound that changed everything once again. This time, it was the distant howling of wolves, coming from somewhere high on the mountain above them. The effect on the bears was immediate and dramatic. Every animal in the circle went rigid, and the giant bear rose to his feet with a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The mother bear immediately moved to cover both cubs with her body, while the other bears began moving to face the new threat. "Wolves," Caleb said grimly. "A pack of wolves is coming down from the high country." The game warden was already speaking into his radio, calling for additional support and trying to coordinate an evacuation plan. But as he spoke, he realized that the situation had become impossibly complex. They now had human civilians, armed hunters, protective bears, and an approaching wolf pack, all converging on the same small clearing. The wolves' howling was getting closer, and now they could hear the individual voices of pack members calling to each other as they moved through the forest. The sound was coming from multiple directions, suggesting that the wolves had spread out to approach from different angles. The bears' reaction to the approaching wolves revealed something that none of the humans had realized before. The circle of bears hadn't just been protecting the babies from human threats. They had been preparing for a much more ancient and deadly conflict. The giant bear began making urgent sounds toward the other bears, and their response was swift and coordinated. They moved from their protective circle into what was clearly a battle formation, with the largest and strongest bears positioned to face the most likely approach routes of the wolves. But throughout this reorganization, the mother bear never left her position protecting the two babies. No matter what threats approached, her priority remained the same, keeping both cubs, human and bear, safe from harm. As the wolves' howling grew closer and the tension in the clearing reached a breaking point, Zara realized that their extraordinary night was about to become something even more dramatic. The protective bond that had formed between two species was about to be tested by the harsh realities of wilderness survival. And in the center of it all, two babies continued to comfort each other, oblivious to the dangers surrounding them, creating a small island of innocence and trust in a world that had suddenly become very dangerous indeed. The wolves' howling reached its peak, echoing off the mountain walls with a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and wild determination. The first wolf appeared at the tree line, a massive gray alpha with eyes that reflected the helicopter's searchlight like twin flames. Behind it, the shadows moved with the fluid grace of a hunting pack that had been perfected over thousands of years. The giant bear's roar of challenge shook snow from the surrounding trees, and the circle of bears tightened their formation. But something unexpected happened in that moment of ultimate tension. The mother bear, instead of joining the defensive line, did something that stunned every creature present. She gently picked up her cub in her mouth and placed it directly next to Iris in Zara's arms. Then, looking at Zara with eyes that held a universe of trust and understanding, she carefully arranged herself so that both babies were sheltered beneath her massive form. The wolf pack had expected to find isolated prey, easy targets scattered by fear and confusion. Instead, they found something that gave even their ancient predator instincts pause. They saw a mother's love that transcended species, a protective bond so powerful that it had united natural enemies in common purpose. Jake Morrison, who had come here to hunt bears, found himself raising his rifle toward the wolves instead. "I can't believe I'm saying this," he muttered, "but nobody threatens babies on my watch. Not even bear cubs." Ray nodded, moving to stand beside his friend with his own weapon ready. "Guess we're all parents here tonight." The lead police officer, abandoning all protocol, positioned himself between the approaching wolves and the protective circle of bears and humans. The game warden joined him, tranquilizer gun at the ready, while the EMT moved closer to ensure she could reach the babies if needed. Derek, who had started this night drunk and looking for excitement, found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. Both men united in their determination to protect what had become an extended family of the most unlikely kind. The wolf alpha paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the scene with intelligent yellow eyes. What it saw was not the scattered vulnerable prey it had expected, but a unified defensive force unlike anything in its experience. Bears and humans standing together, armed officials and local hunters sharing common cause, all centered around two small creatures who represented the future of both species. Iris chose that moment to do something that changed everything. The human baby, nestled safely beneath the mother bear's protective form, reached up and gently placed her tiny hand on the massive animal's chest. The bear cub, seeing this gesture, did the same with its small paw. In that instant, as two babies touched the heart of their protector, something passed between them that was visible to every creature present. It wasn't magic, exactly, but it was something deeper than ordinary understanding. It was the recognition that love and protection create bonds stronger than any natural law. The mother bear began to purr, a sound so deep and resonant that it seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The other bears joined in, creating a harmony that spoke of family, of belonging, of the fierce joy that comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The wolf alpha tilted its massive head, listening to this sound that it had never heard before. Slowly, deliberately, it sat down in the snow. One by one, the other wolves followed suit, their hunting formation dissolving into something that looked almost like respect. The giant bear, seeing that the immediate threat had passed, moved to stand beside the mother bear. He looked down at the two babies nestled together, human and bear cub sleeping peacefully in each other's arms, and made a sound that could only be described as contentment. Jake lowered his rifle completely, tears streaming down his weathered face. "In 40 years of living in these mountains," he said quietly, I never knew animals could feel like this. I never knew we could all be family." The helicopter pilot's voice came through the speaker one final time, but now it carried wonder instead of alarm. "Ground control. Situation resolved through means not covered in any manual. Repeat, situation resolved. No shots fired, no casualties, human or animal. What we witnessed here tonight, well, it's going to take a while to write the report." As the wolves melted back into the forest and the bears began to disperse to their own territories, the mother bear remained with her cub beside Zara and Iris. The massive animal looked at each of the humans present, as if she were memorizing their faces, storing the memory of this night when two species had discovered they could trust each other completely. Then, with infinite gentleness, she nuzzled her cub one final time before encouraging it to move away from the human family. The little bear looked back at Iris with obvious reluctance, making soft sounds that seemed to say goodbye. Iris, though barely 3 months old, seemed to understand. She reached toward the departing cub with both hands, making sounds that weren't quite words, but carried all the meaning of a promise to remember. The mother bear was the last to leave. She approached Zara one final time, touched Iris's cheek with her enormous nose, then looked directly into Zara's eyes. In that gaze, Zara saw recognition, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like friendship. "Thank you," Zara whispered, and the bear nodded once before turning to follow her cub into the forest. As the last of the bears disappeared into the trees, the humans stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. The official vehicles began to depart, their drivers shaking their heads and talking quietly among themselves about the impossibility of what they had seen. Jake and his hunting companions packed away their rifles, their appetite for hunting forever changed by the night's events. "I'm thinking of taking up wildlife photography instead," Ray said as they prepared to leave. "Seems like there's a lot more to learn about these animals than we ever imagined." Derek was the last of the outsiders to leave, pausing to look back at the cabin where this extraordinary night had begun. "Caleb," he said seriously, "what happened here tonight? It's going to change how people think about wild animals, isn't it?" Caleb nodded, holding Zara and Iris close as they watched the final vehicle disappear down the mountain road. "I think it's going to change how we think about a lot of things." As the family returned to their cabin, Zara noticed that the piece of fur the mother bear had given them was still in Iris's crib, exactly where they had left it hours ago. The soft, warm fur that had started this entire adventure, given freely by a wild animal to comfort a human baby. That night, as Iris slept peacefully in her crib, wrapped in the bear's gift, Zara and Caleb sat by the window looking out at the forest. Somewhere in those dark trees, they knew, a mother bear was telling her cub the story of the night they discovered that family could mean more than just shared blood. Years later, when Iris was old enough to understand, they would tell her the story of the night she made her first friend. They would tell her about the mother bear who shared her fur, about the courage that love could inspire, and about the magic that happened when different species recognized the same fierce protective instinct in each other. But they would never be able to fully explain the most important part of the story: how a 3-month-old baby and a bear cub, in their innocent acceptance of each other, had taught an entire mountain community that the boundaries between wild and tame, dangerous and safe, enemy and friend, existed mostly in the fears and prejudices of the adult world. The piece of bear fur remained in Iris's crib until she outgrew it, and then it became a family treasure, a reminder of the night when love proved stronger than instinct, when trust overcame fear, and when a small human baby and a bear cub showed the world that the heart recognizes no boundaries when it comes to protecting those we cherish. And sometimes, on quiet mountain nights when the wind was just right, Neighbors swore they could hear the sound of a mother bear calling softly through the trees, as if she were checking on a human baby who had once been part of her family, if only for one magical, impossible night.